Everyone loves a good comparison video, right? We compare cars before we buy them. We compare groceries. We compare gadgets. We just like seeing one thing next to another. We like before and after. It's just human nature in general. And in preparing for this review of the Samsung Chromebook Plus V2, it was my nature and my habit to compare it. I wanted to compare it to the first version of the Samsung Chromebook Plus. And honestly, that just didn't do anyone justice, and I don't think it would have helped you all out as viewers. And ultimately, we want to help you make a purchasing decision based on the price of a device and the things it brings to the table. And to sit and look at it versus its predecessor just really didn't seem fair. Now, we'll do a video of that at some point down the road. We're going to get these two side by side and really look at the difference in the two of them. But ultimately, if you walk into a store and you come across this device, you're going to look at it and say, is it worth the money? Is it worth me purchasing this device? And so we want to review this thing just like any other Chromebook we've reviewed. We want to look at all the things from the build, the screen, the speakers, the way it performs, and all those kind of things. And at the end say, is it worth the money? Should you buy it? And so it took us a little longer than normal to do this review, and that's kind of the reason. We wanted to compare it, but this isn't going to be that video. So let's dive in and look at a review of the Samsung Chromebook Plus V2. So let's start off with the build. Overall, this thing is well put together. It's got nice rounded edges and it just feels good in the hand and is overall really solid feeling. There's a little bit of flex if you really wrench on it, but in general, it feels pretty good. And for Chromebooks in this price range, I think Samsung did a good job putting it together. Now, you will notice there's a plastic bottom, and that's not that odd, honestly. There's quite a few Chromebooks, even in higher price brackets. The HP Chromebook 13 comes to mind. The newer Acer Chromebook 15 both have plastic bottoms, and for me, that's just never been a troubling thing. It saves a little bit of weight. And on this one, it's hard to even tell that it's not aluminum like the rest of the chassis. Overall, the color of the device is really cool. It's a little bit of a unique take on the powdered aluminum finish. It's a little bit darker, more akin to what you see on some of the new MacBook Pros and stuff like that, the space gray. But it's just an overall great color. The device just looks really, really good. The one thing I have a little bit of issue with on the build quality of this thing is it is a convertible. And so a lot of times convertibles can have a little bit of trouble with the way that they're weighted. And this one in particular, the screen is just a little bit heavy. It's not that troublesome when it's on a desk, but when it's in your lap, you're going to feel it. It's not tipping over or falling over or anything like that. And the hinge is pretty sturdy, so when you're touching on the screen, that's not really an issue either. It just feels a little weird. Usually the bottom end of the device is a little heavier than the screen, and that's not exactly the case here. So let's talk about the screen. This one is a 16:10 screen, which is slightly rare actually in the Chrome OS world. We have a growing number of 3:2 panels and a lot of 16:9 panels. So this one comes kind of in between the two. So if you're not a fan of the taller 3:2 like that's in a Pixelbook or the HP Chromebook X2 or the Samsung Chromebook Plus or Pro that come before this one, 16:10 is kind of a nice trade-off because it's not quite as letterboxed as a 16:9, but it's not quite as tall as a 3:2. And the resolution we get here is kind of HD, plus a few pixels. So standard HD at 16:9 is 1920 by 1080. This one's 1920 by 1200. So those extra pixels coming across the bottom and give you that slightly taller screen. And so this is kind of what you see on a MacBook Pro or a MacBook. They really like that 16:10 ratio, and it gives you a little more bang for your buck because it's a 12.2-inch screen. That slightly taller aspect ratio makes it feel like a little bit bigger screen. It kind of feels and performs more like a 13-inch kind of device here. Ultimately, it's bright enough, around 300 nits. It's not quite as bright as the panel you get on the X2 and the Pixelbook and stuff like that. Those are 400 nit panels, but it's 3 to 350, I think, somewhere in there. And honestly, day-to-day use, it was just fine. It would probably struggle a little bit outside under direct sunlight, but under normal lighting situations at a coffee shop, in an office, near a window, all those kind of things, it does just fine. And the same can be said about the pixel density. So sure, it's not this 2400 by 1600 super pixel dense panel that you get on the Pixelbook, but it's still a high def screen. And ultimately, because 12.2 inches crams a ton of pixels in when we're talking about 1920 by 1200 resolution, you don't see pixels. Everything still looks really sharp. So the benefit you have here is that you get a little bit of a bump in performance because it doesn't have to push all of those pixels on the screens. The keyboard and trackpad on this device are actually standout. I've not used too many Chromebooks that I've enjoyed the keyboard quite as much as this device. And I'm not a huge stickler on keyboards. It doesn't have a backlight. And I know for some of you all that's a deal breaker, but for me it's not. And overall, just the clickiness of the keys, the travel, and just the overall experience of using the keyboard in general for me was just fantastic and second only to the Pixelbook, honestly. The same could be said of the trackpad. I don't know exactly what it's made of, but it resists oils. The click mechanism is great. It's quiet, but it works really, really well. It feels firm enough, but not super smushy. It just performs really, really well. All the gestures you would expect to use, swiping up and down, two-finger gestures, all that stuff works exactly like you would expect, but it's just consistent and it feels really good to use. Onto the input methods, you get a pretty interesting mix of things here. So we got two USB Type-Cs and a USB Type-A, and so I'm a big fan of still seeing this. USB-C hasn't really gotten to the point we all expected it to by this point. We kind of thought like this would be the one connector to kill everything and it will just do everything. And honestly, it has the potential to do so. It's just we don't have all the accessories that work with it just yet. And even the ones that are supposed to work with it don't always work the way you expect them to. And so it's very nice to see a fallback USB-A on a device that's coming out in 2018, honestly. And I know every device won't have this, but it's just nice to have. One problem they did with this particular device though is they put both USB-Cs on the same side, and to me that's a huge fail, because ultimately when you're going to use USB-Cs, a lot of times you're going to use them with some sort of docking mechanism. And so if I'm sitting this down on my desk and then I'm going to plug a USB-C dock into it, maybe I don't have a dock, I've got one USB-C for my display and I've got one USB-C for my charging. It'd be nice to just have them on opposite sides of the device, so that maybe in one scenario it's easier to plug them in over here, and in another scenario it's easier over here. You don't get that option here. You're going to the left side of the device whether you like it or not if you're using USB-C. And so every other device we've seen, for the most part, other than the HP 13 that I can think of off the top of my head, has the USB-Cs on both sides, so that you kind of get some flexibility, and Samsung threw them both on one side. In addition, there's a standard micro SD card slot, and there's no weird fumbly hinges or anything trying to cover it up. One of the things we don't usually mention in Chromebook reviews is the camera. And this particular device, the front-facing camera is not really that big of a deal, but the world-facing camera that is actually on the keyboard deck is kind of a big deal, and it's one of the first ones that we've had like this in a Chromebook. It's a 13 megapixel autofocus camera. Now, the problem is right now we don't have anything to show you with it, because this device is still running software that has the old Chrome OS camera on it that is absolutely terrible and not even worth using. However, we do know that the substitute for that is coming via the Arc camera. So the Google camera that you see on Google's phones will be on Chromebooks. It will make this camera actually worth using. Though in general, speakers on Chromebooks or laptops aren't that great, the speakers on this one are surprisingly good. They are downward firing, so they're not in the best position ever, but they're pretty rich sounding. They're not the loudest things I've ever heard. My Pixelbook gets louder, but it's kind of harsh and a little bit tinny. This one has a nice kind of full sound to it that I really appreciate. The thing that comes closest to mind when I'm comparing speakers like this is the iPad. A lot of times I'll listen to something on an iPad and think, man, Apple did this right. A few years back, they just kind of fixed the speakers on iPads, and iPads just always sound good. The speakers always sound way fuller and way bigger than they should for a smaller device. And Samsung's kind of done that here. So I don't know whether it's the chambers or the speakers or a combination. The speakers actually sound really good here. And we can't forget to talk about the pen. So Samsung was the first to bring kind of this stowable pen to a Chromebook, and you know, they've done the same thing here. So the last 3 Chromebooks now that they've made have the stowable pen. It's a little bit different. This go around, it just kind of, you grab it and it slides out. It does still have the click mechanism, but the stowing is a little bit different. The shape of the top of the pen's a little bit different, but overall we're talking the same inking experience here. Things like Google Keep work, but not that well. But then when you get into something like Squid, the inking feels really great. Samsung's done a great job of figuring out how to make pen tips and screens that go together really well and just feel really natural when you're writing. The one thing to remember here, we're dealing with an EMR stylus. I know a lot of artists really like that better, and so you are getting an EMR stylus here. However, it's smaller, so it's not going to be a full-size pen feel like you would get with the Pixelbook or the HP. It is that smaller kind of standard Samsung size stylus. So there are pros and cons here. I still favor the smaller stylus that I can put in the device and take it with me and not have to worry about whether or not I have my stylus with me. But that's just my preference. For most people, I think having it with you is more important than whether it's large or small. And so I think Samsung's done a good job here of continuing to make room for the stylus and not making you tote it around separately. So we've talked about all the outside components. How's this thing actually get along? Well, inside we have an Intel Celeron 3965Y, 4 gigs of RAM, 32 gigs of eMMC storage. So what does that mean exactly? Well, if you like benchmarks, Octane gets about 14,000 on this thing, and speedometer is around 75 to 77, somewhere in that range. And so what that means for me is if I'm looking at those benchmark scores, this thing has enough performance under the hood to kind of get out of your way, so that the general user's probably not going to be thinking about performance that often. And that's kind of where we want to get with Chromebooks in general. Sure, it's nice to have the ones that just get bonkers Octane scores and speedometer scores and never ever have a hiccup and never think about anything. But that stuff costs money. And in general, Intel is making chips all over the place. I couldn't even tell you where the 3965Y slots itself, what generation and all that kind of stuff. I don't know anymore because they've convoluted their naming scheme so bad. What I can tell you is from day-to-day use, this thing actually gets along really, really well. I put it through the same paces I put everything else through. I run everything that I normally would run, graphics programs, IDEs, multiple tabs open, music players, all that kind of stuff, split screens, all of that stuff, and really never had any performance issues in general. And it does so with decent battery life. We're talking 7 to 10 hours, and I know that's a decent range there, but 7 to 10 hours of mixed use. If you're going at it pretty hard and have a lot of stuff open, you're probably going to get closer to that 7-hour range. But you know, you have a couple tabs open, you're browsing the internet, you're probably 9 to 10 hours, somewhere in that range. So the question we always arrive at this point in the video is, should you buy this? A couple things to consider. Samsung wants $499 for this thing retail. We were able to pick this one up for $450 retail, and I think that's getting closer to the realistic price range for this device. Not comparing it to a bunch of other things, just saying, okay, what is this thing worth? I think if we get down into the $425 to $399, somewhere in there, I think we get to the point where this becomes an easy buy. This becomes a device that when you've spent that amount of money, you're going to be really happy with the result. You're going to be happy with the performance. You're going to be happy with the screen, and that you got a pen, and that it's convertible, and it does all of these things really well. For some reason, $500 for me feels a little steep. However, there's not a ton of Chromebooks in the $500 price bracket at the time of filming right now. I mean, we're literally talking probably about the Asus C302 is about the only other thing in this price bracket, or the older version of this. And like I said, we're not going to get into comparing it to its predecessor. But in general, as a daily driver, a device that you can use, I would say over those two devices that are in that price bracket, I like this one better. I would be happier with this one than those two devices. If Samsung brings this device down, or Best Buy, or whoever you're buying this device from, gets it down to that $450, $425 range, 100% I'd say I think you're going to be really, really happy with this device. If you're coming across it at $500, I'm just not sure. I'm not sure what I would feel if I spent that kind of money on this device. And so at the end of the day, hopefully that helps you a little bit make a purchasing decision. And there's a good chance that by the time you're watching this video, this thing will be down in that price range. And at that point, again, I would say, go for it. I think it's a good buy at that price. It brings a lot to the table. It brings a really, really good screen, an excellent keyboard, an excellent trackpad, a built-in stowable stylus, really good speakers. I mean, when we start laying all those stats out on the table, and good performance and battery life, by the way, then, you know, $450 isn't really that much to pay for a computer now, is it? Oh, and it runs Android apps, and it'll have Linux apps too pretty soon. So it sounds like a really compelling case when we start talking about all of those things together. And I think Samsung's done a really good job here. And a lot of people are really getting bent out of shape comparing it to other things. But if we look at it by itself, if we look at it on its own merits, I think Samsung's put together a really nice package. And I think it's one that you'd be pretty happy with if you can get it for around $450 or less. But guys, that's been it for this one. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. And until next time, we'll see you.